I believe people should live in the way they want to live, but sometimes we do need agreements to make it equitable for everyone involved, right? What's the role of the new third party or fourth party, and who's the parent? And I find these shifts in our society fascinating, but also potentially a slippery slope for people to be, to feel they've been taken advantage of if they're not able to enter into a conscious agreement.
Hi, I'm Rachel Green, Brooklyn-based divorce mediator and collaborative attorney, and this is my podcast, Keep the Kids in Mind. Join me as I chat with other industry professionals about everything from smoothly navigating your way through divorce to prenups, all the while keeping the kids in mind. Hi, I'm Rachel Green, and this is my podcast, Keep the Kids in Mind. Today, I'm very pleased to have as our guest Cherie Morris. She is a lawyer by training and long practice, and she has now shifted her practice entirely to divorce coaching and conflict mediation. For almost 9 years, she served individuals and couples contemplating during divorce or post-divorce complications. She's also a certified parent coordinator, helping families resolve conflicts. And I'm sure she's going to have a lot to tell us about her experiences helping her clients keep their kids in mind. Welcome, Cherie.
Thank you, Rachel. It's my pleasure to be here today.
So you've had such an interesting journey starting out as an attorney, working in this field of families in transition. So what were your experiences as an attorney, and what has led to your career path of shifting your focus?
Well, thank you for asking, Rachel. I was a practicing attorney for a long time. My preference was always to stay on the side of cooperation, facilitation, mediation, but I was actually a litigator, so that wasn't always possible. And what I noticed when I transitioned in my own divorce was that people in families can't necessarily apply the same structure, or shouldn't apply the same structure that we apply to all other kinds of law if we want to preserve the family system. So I happened to have a husband at the time who was also a litigator, and we played by different rules. In litigation, the idea is you're right or you're wrong, and there's a winner and there's a loser. And from my perspective, we needed to think of something different for our family system. So it was from my own experience that I eventually did additional certification to become a full-time coach and parent coordinator, and to work in the coaching mediation space. I discovered transformational mediation, which is really about listening, hearing, and responding to what the other is saying. And that informed the rest of my work, becoming collaboratively trained and really working in the space with couples to teach them skills they may not have, to listen to each other, and so that they can effectively co-parent and take care of themselves and their children.
So were you a matrimonial litigator?
We were not. My former husband and I had a law firm together, but it wasn't family law. I practiced a number of different kinds of law, from pharmaceutical defense to insurance defense to plaintiffs' class action cases, which was, of course, on the side of truth and justice. And it's just not a very cooperative kind of law, right? So,
yeah. So I mean, most litigation I actually never litigated, but it seems to me that's ritualized war. I mean, you're out to destroy the other person, the other company, the other entity, whatever.
Right.
And you're really trying to, you win. There's a winner and a loser. And I agree 100% that with families, your children are not going to thank you for destroying their other parent.
Oh, that is well said. And the idea of ritualized war is what I have seen happen also, right, in family law matters. And it's terrible for everyone involved, and including the adults. And there's just no reason to apply that paradigm. I mean, we could argue about whether it should be applied
we
anywhere.
can keep the adults in mind too, not just the kids.
I did. Yes, exactly. Imagine. And I find that, that old expression of if mom ain't happy, ain't nobody going to be happy, right? Well, it applies to obviously moms, dads, any parent. And I think that the better we can do for ourselves, the better we can do for our kids. But maybe we don't know how to do that. So, learning those skills, like anything else, can be part of the work I do.
So do you work with people as a coach, but also as a mediator? Um, I mean, those are distinct roles. You would either be a mediator or a coach.
Great question. I can work with the individual as a coach, and that would be a distinct role. When I'm mediating, I'm doing coaching mediation, Rachel. So I will not be
Oh,
a legal mediator. So in my perfect narrative, people have their individual lawyer. If they prefer just a mediator, sure, they can do that. But I really like people to have individual advice. And then when they have difficulty, they can come to me. We can talk about anything from the kids to, why someone wants to keep the house and how realistic that is. But I find the direct communication, not between lawyers, right, which can get complicated and tough, but really hearing with proper language, the skills we've worked on in the background. Because when I meet with a couple, I'm meeting with them individually and then we come together, which makes it less like traditional legal mediation and definitely in the coaching space. But we apply that transformative lens. Let's listen, let's use empathy, and then let's speak. Let's speak from our heart, but it's important to say it in a way that the other person will hear.
right, right. So your focus is on facilitating the communication and trying to find out where the tangles are that's stopping the communication getting from one person to the other.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
love your language, by the way. Ritualized war,
Thanks.
tangles, really good.
Thank you. Um, and what do you do in a situation where, very typically, I'm sure this is true in Washington and in DC and all the places that you've worked and lived, but that it's very common. I've seen in my practice that one person has probably been thinking about this and mulling it over, and maybe the idea crosses their mind, maybe we need to separate and end our relationship, and then they go, oh, no, that's not what I want to happen. And then the thought comes back again 4 months later, and maybe it's 2 or 3 years that before they tell their other spouse, and the other spouse is like, pew, and they're just completely blindsided. And so you have one person who's been thinking about this for years and the other person who has never thought about it. And part of the process I find as a mediator, or in a collaborative process, I mean, that's all that I do is those two processes. And I find that a lot of the process is giving the second person time, because you can't really think how you want your future structured until you're ready to say, this is my future. Like, this is where we're headed.
It's so true, Rachel. And I'm really glad you brought up that topic. It's something I see all the time. And the one, as you say, who's contemplated for 2 or 3 years, maybe, is already done. I call it emotionally done. And now sometimes they're asking their spouse to catch up really quickly. So
Yeah.
the work I do around that initially, especially if I'm working with a couple, is very practical. I believe if someone needs to be in therapy, they should have the therapeutic support too. But in coaching, I will work to get them engaged, for example, if they have not been in their finances. Let's take this a step at a time. Because if they're living in the space of fear, I find the most practical way to solve that is to put them in the space of empowerment, which means, do you understand your finances? Are you hearing what your spouse says about the children, that this can be okay? And of course, I'm talking about situations where it can be okay, or that they're both, but also talking to the spouse who's ready to go, ready to leave, about how important it is to hold space for the other and to really give us a little time to help them catch up. And in a really practical way, we're going to be taking active steps. It doesn't mean burying your head in the sand, right? And I also find, Rachel, and I wonder if this is true for you too, that people who claim to be blindsided in general, yes, it may be a shock, it may be a surprise, but there were signs. Something was
Yeah.
happening.
I think you're right. I mean, just like, I think that on some level, 99% of the time, when your spouse is having an affair, even though you're like trying not to know it, you're trying to deny it, but on some level, that something has shifted,
It's
and maybe it's just that they're not putting all their energy into the dyad of the two of you. There's like the energy is going somewhere else, and it's just a change. Um, on
that's right.
some level, you knew it.
And I think for that kind of work, it's really more global because it tends to be someone who might be avoidant, right, in their conflict method. So how do we bring them to the table without overwhelm to calm that escalation they may have emotionally, but also in a really practical way, make sure they're paying attention to their interests, because ultimately they've got to show up if they want to take care of their own future.
Right, right. Yeah. So that's all so interesting and, so helpful to families who are in transition. Do you see a big difference between, more and more I'm seeing couples who have a child or children together but never got married. And it seems like there's like a difference in the level of conflict between them. And it makes me think, I don't know if you've observed this as well. It makes me wonder whether there's something about having had that period in your relationship where you were idealistic and in love and, stood up in front of friends and family and said, I'm going to commit to this person. That there's something about that even later, years later, they're divorcing. It helps them to, just to have had that shared history.
That's a great point, Rachel. I'm so glad you asked such interesting questions, and the reason it resonates for me is personally and professionally, and I'll tell you why. I am now part of a blended family after my divorce, but we're domestic partners, my
Yeah.
partner and I, and he and I have not stood up in front of friends and family, but we've now been blended as a family with children for about 10 years. But I take your point, and one thing I noticed professionally that we did differently is that some couples who do not marry, right, or have a ritualized ceremony even haven't also combined in other ways that are impactful. So, for example, they may not share finances, which in the end could be okay for them, but also can lead to resentment if they haven't come up with a system that feels equitable to both of them, for example.
Mm, hmm.
So even though on the one hand I haven't had the ritual, we made a conscious decision to do that differently with finances, in part based on the work I do. I think it's important that everybody become really aware of who's where the money is and how you're going to spend it, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm curious if from your perspective, part of the not being married means they haven't really integrated on a number of levels.
That's a very good point. So you and your partner now do share information about finances. You're transparent about that, and
That's right.
you have consciously discussed how you're going to share finances so that you both feel comfortable with that.
That's
Right?
right. In
Yeah,
fact, we created, an agreement, a legal agreement. And I find as you talk about families that haven't married, I now see more families that look different. Polyamory, right?
right.
Now beginning to see structures that look very different than the traditional family. So,
Yeah, definitely.
and I think it's fascinating because I believe people should live in the way they want to live, but sometimes we do need agreements to make it equitable for everyone involved, right?
Right.
What's the role of the new third party or fourth party, and who's the parent? And I find these shifts in our society fascinating, but also potentially a slippery slope for people to be, to feel they've been taken advantage of if they're not able to enter into a conscious agreement.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. So it might be your work or your experience in your prior marriage and the experience you went through about with that relationship ending that kind of informed your structure that you and your partner came up with
I
to
think
try
so.
to, yeah.
I,
And I think that's a very good point that the couples who are not married may not have had that experience and had an the under the education as an attorney to be able to draft an agreement. And I think you're right that they haven't joined finances, and they haven't probably joined other other aspects of their lives consciously to try to build a foundation for the relationship to last. And then there were secret resentments building up that may have led to the end of the relationship.
I'm currently working with a couple, in fact, that had opened their marriage. So they're not technically polyamorous in any sense, but I find some of the complications from that, whether they decide to stay or go, decide to stay together, and they have two teenage children, is about those agreements between them and the other parties. So right now, it's really still they are the primary. But what happens if you do open the marriage and you're doing it for emotional reasons, physical reasons, whatever they may be? But then what happens next? Because the risk is pretty high that someone becomes emotionally attached to someone else. It's new, it's exciting, right? But then what? So I really try not to encourage people to think about everything that can go wrong, but to think consciously about what could be next, and just to enter agreements before you do things like open a marriage about how you want things to look for your children and for each other. And when your
Yeah.
instincts are probably going to be well intended.
Yeah. I've had 2 or 3 couples, I think, this year who have had conflicts over having open marriages or being polyamorous. And, one person said, well, we always said we were going to do this. And the other person said, I never said I was going to do that. And they're splitting up and saying, you changed the contract midway. And, it is interesting how much that's growing in society.
And I think we in this space helping support people who have these challenges, really have an obligation to learn the terminology. In working with a different client yesterday, she was distinguishing for me, joining a swingers club versus being polyamorous, like the emotional commitment to being in a polyamorous relationship versus looking outside a relationship for sexual reasons only.
Mm,
And I think it's interesting, but again, these are conscious, conversations. If you're willing, from my perspective, right, as a professional, to be willing to think about sexual intimacy outside of your marriage that you want to talk about with your partner, you should really come to some agreement about what that looks like, because there are just so many unintended consequences.
yeah, yeah. And people can be really hurt.
Yes.
Yeah. Um, so what would you say are the benefits of divorce coaching?
So I think for divorce coaching, the real benefit is that you have someone with experience in divorce, first of all. If you do divorce, you generally do it only once, maybe twice. I mean, we've heard people who divorce many more times, but it's not something you're doing every day. So the benefit of having a professional who understands the stages, the process, and can help you in a really practical way, not spend time always with your legal professional to solve a problem that may not be legal. So it can be very practical. I don't understand what'll happen next. I don't know how to accomplish this thing. I can't get my, husband to pick up the kids on time. Well, how are you asking him? Well, I'm telling him he's always late, and that's not working. So we really try to, in a very practical way, make sure that you're functioning during something that can be a very emotionally stressful process in a really positive way for you. You learn how to talk to your kids about what's happening. You know how to focus on their age and stage developmentally. So I think divorce coaching, and I'd say in the last 10 years it's really exploded. People didn't even know before, right? Like that this resource existed. So I think the really practical side of it can help unburden the legal system and the lawyers, and have a place that feels like a soft landing for people who need it. And honestly, I think most adults need it, and then they do better with their kids.
So, would you typically talk to somebody who like at what stage would they come to you? Have they decided that there's definitely separating? And by the way, when I say divorce, I mean divorce and or separating,
Right.
as well, because as we were saying, there are more and more people who
Right.
are not getting married, partly because of the high divorce rate, and then from a legal perspective, the things they have to talk about are fewer and it's simpler. From an emotional perspective, it's very much the same.
Yes.
Um, but like, at what point do people reach out to you, or should they reach out to you?
It's a great question. And I find the sooner you do, the better. And I'll work with people at any stage. So if you're contemplating but haven't decided for sure, if you're the one that's being left, so maybe you don't have a choice, that's a great time to reach out, because if you have decided to leave, but you aren't the primary keeper of your finances, so you really have no idea of the financial consequences of leaving. Now's a good time to get really granular and think about, what do you need to think about with regard to money, with regard to the kids, with regard to what's next and best for you. So ideally, the framework is very early, but sometimes people, as we know, either stumble or consciously move along, and then complications arise. So if that happens, I'm really ready at any stage, even in litigation, to jump in and say, okay, what can we do to de-escalate the system? So if you feel like things are out of control in a way that's not manageable, we'll try to hit a reset button. Now, it can be more complicated to do that once things are escalated, but not impossible. But I really like to start at the beginning when I can, because I even, make recommendations for legal professionals, for financial professionals, for therapeutic professionals that are geared toward de-escalation. And as we know, not everyone in the system is. So if we already have litigation with a high conflict litigator that's gearing up, your spouse, then that can be problematic. It can be a harder place to start. But it's not impossible, and I've seen it happen, and I've seen families come out the other side doing better, even if it started in a high conflict way.
Really? Can you like give me an example
So I actually had
of family? Yeah.
a gray divorce couple that was in litigation, and their young adult children had been pulled into the conflict and were really suffering. And, it was an interesting narrative, because I think both mom and dad thought, well, they're adults, they should be able to understand my perspective, right? Rather than, they're still children and our children and part of this family. So,
Right.
you
Emotionally, they're still the parents and children, even if they're 30.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's what was happening. And what I saw when I, because they were adults, I don't talk to children that are minors, but adult children, if they choose, can participate. Their grief was profound, as you can imagine, to be stuck in between mom and dad. So I worked with mom and dad to say, look, what is it you're really arguing over, first of all? And it really wasn't very much.
Oh,
And if we can talk about that, and talk about the meaning behind the thing that you want so much, which maybe could be given to the other from another category, right? Rather than give up this $70,000 that was a joint gift from one of your parents to both of you, let's look at that $70,000 from the savings account. It just required a little creativity, but then they were able to step back and recognize the suffering of their kids, which they didn't want. They just were so caught in their own bubble. So
oh,
once we started talking and they talked together, I think facilitation, and it's not that it was special to me or unique to me, but having a facilitator help them talk. They were using better language, more supportive language. They were clearer about what they needed and wanted. And once we did that, they have been able to attend family weddings. I hear from each of them about how they're doing. One and the other spouse actually took them even post divorce to the procedure. We all might joke and think, well, that would be one of the benefits of divorce, not having to do that. But they were able to come back together and actually support one another in ways that were really profound, and that made sure their kids weren't caught in the middle or further burdened by what was happening. And are they better for the divorce? I think so, right? It may have
yeah,
been longer in the marriage than it should have been, which can also happen if they stayed together until the children were adults, but they actually didn't have the skills to apply to reduce the conflict for the kids. So the results were just as devastating, honestly.
yeah. So that's so interesting. That it sounds like that couple, the litigation process just, was like pitting them against each other, like, and just keeping them not able to reach agreement, because it's like the litigation process, you're just becoming like more and more set into your position, your ideas that this is the settlement I need. And you just spend your time, fuming over like around and around, and it's going in your brain like, I need this. Why won't the
Right.
other partner accept that? I really need this. I just need this because of this is, you're building arguments. Um, and once you were able to like pull that apart and say, what does this really mean to you? And then think, well, okay, so if what you really need is, $70,000, are there other sources for, I mean, you were able to help them figure out, like, it's not just this gift that we received and the fairness of it, but like what will be the difference to you in reality? Okay, it's $70,000. If that's what you need, let's talk about ways that you could get that in the settlement. And then that like freed them up to be able to focus on their kids, it
That's
sounds like.
that's right. And I think one of the interesting things to me is once you're in litigation and doing interrogatories, which are, as you well know, those questions you answer and
I only
request.
vaguely know because I never litigated.
Okay. And requests for production of documents, they're so legalistic and so formulaic and so meaningless oftentimes. So then it's like you're talking past each other, which is, I think, what was happening in this case too.
Mhm.
And then lawyers are busy. So they're not,
Right.
when they call the opposing counsel, they're focused on this discrete issue and not really able to address the more global problem. So it wasn't, again, to give myself too much credit that I was unique in my ability to facilitate, but I think being able to pull apart, as you said, those threads and look at what was really happening was really impactful. So from my perspective, sometimes getting people in who have conflict, who are already somehow in litigation, we can transform that. Now it takes them, right, as well as me. They have to be willing to let go some of their attachment to being right, or to winning. But what does winning really look like in our lives? And as they say, you can be right and still not be happy. So let's see
Right.
what we can do to transform that narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a really good article in the New York Times a few weeks ago about how to have a cheaper divorce.
Yes.
And they were talking about mediation. They were talking about how you have to be willing to let some things go, because because you want a cheaper divorce. Like if you want a cheaper, quicker divorce, you'll have to give up some things that you otherwise would maybe decide to fight further for. Um, it's not free. It'll have some cost to you, but you'll get through your divorce with fewer scars and having maybe saved some, still had savings for your children to go to college.
And it's interesting, that expression, if I had a nickel for every time I heard, well, one of the things I often hear from people who have been divorced that didn't know about coaching or didn't have the support of coaching or mediation, wow, I spent so much time and energy fighting about things that the legal system couldn't solve for me. And
Yeah.
so really, if you can get the support somewhere else, you can recognize what you will not be able to do in the legal system, what it's not built to do, or and save a
Yeah.
lot of resources for the future.
But it is amazing what people don't know. I mean, I had a couple I worked with in mediation, and they were, struggling with resolving things. And the husband, after one session, he said, this, I don't think this is working. I'm going to go to court. I'm going to go on Monday. So I'll see the judge on Monday morning, and when will I get an answer? I was like, court doesn't really work that way.
Not
You're
going
not
to
going to see
happen.
the judge for a very long time. When you see the judge, he or she is not going to want to hear from you. They'll want to hear from your lawyer. I mean, people have this fantasy that the judge is going to be, the wise father that they never had. And and will say, "Oh, you poor thing, you've been putting up with that person all these years. I recognize your suffering. You're an angel." And
Oh, Rachel, this is so true. I'm really glad you're naming this because you hear this really quite often, and people don't understand that what they're asking is for someone that knows much less about their lives, will not know about their lives, and certainly less about their children to make decisions
yeah,
that impact
right,
them for a long time.
right. Whereas in mediation or in a collaborative process, they do have the time to tell their story and have their lawyers hear it. And I mean, and they're more importantly have their ex hear it,
Yeah.
and perhaps even have a chance to have them understand how you felt and recognize what suffering. I mean, I've seen situations where somebody apologizes and says, I'm sorry I couldn't do that better and meet your needs, and I was struggling with A, B, and C, and I couldn't. I did the best I could, but I recognize that I hurt you, and I'm sorry about that. I mean, it's so amazing when you see something like that.
Well, it was interesting. Yesterday, I was talking with one of the couple I was dealing with, and she said, if only he could say he was grateful that I wasn't, enough, and that I'm showing up enough now in this divorce. But it was the first time, and we've been working together months, that she really was able to tell me what she needed to be able to shift. And it was again another property issue, smaller, but still, it was really more about saying, instead of always saying, you've done something wrong or you need to do X or Y, just say it was enough and this is enough and we can be done. And it was really, I think it does take the work and the time over time to get there, but it was really transformative and amazing. And I haven't yet had the opportunity to talk to him yet to say, hey, I want you to hear what I heard. And what do you think you could do from your perspective to show up in this way? Are you even aware that maybe she needs this meaning to hold, and would you be able to say some words that fit that bill? And my guess is he will. He's actually the one that wanted the very cooperative process. And I don't think he recognizes the extent to which that implicit criticism may always be present. So
Mm,
certainly because they're going to be co-parenting young adult children, it's important that they increase their good communication as they navigate, as what we know to be an important stage for kids.
yeah, yeah. Well, I always feel like kind of privileged to be, uh, to have people share their lives and their hurts and their hopes, and to be a part of that process. I feel like honored to have clients who let me do that because it's so meaningful.
It's such an intimate space, really, isn't it?
Hmm. Yeah, it is. So, what are some of the takeaways that you would want people to have from our conversation, or maybe a couple of things that you would make sure clients are aware of when they come to you for coaching?
I think one of the things that we get to right away is, what can you do and control in this process? And of course, the answer really is only you, meaning me. So really take stock of that and recognize that, especially in moments when you're escalated, that you can only control your response, not what the other person is doing. So
Hmm.
framing a response in terms of de-escalation helps, because first of all, sometimes they're trying to get that reaction from you and that escalation. So if they don't get it, then you're not hooked in and they're not hooked back. Um, and just remember that each day you have an opportunity to recreate this identity of who you are and who you want to be. Even if they're pointing fingers and saying you always, you never, each day you can refresh your behavior, and you get to decide how you're going to be, how you can feel empowered. Even if you feel a victim of your divorce, even if you don't want it, what can you do for your next stage that helps you feel like you are in charge of who you want to be? Um, and if you can't do it alone, that's why we're here. I think that's why mediation works. I think that's why coaching works. So I just encourage people to let go what they can, control what they can, which is only how they respond and react and de escalate. And it really works. It works for adults and it really helps kids too.
Yeah, I love that reframe, that you can every day you can make a choice. Am I going to respond the way I've always responded, through these years of our relationship, or do I want to try to find a different way to respond? That's really great, because sometimes issues come up, um, and somebody says, "Well, he's always been late picking up the kids, and I thought that when we divorced, he would take more responsibility. And I find myself saying, look, if he didn't change during the marriage, I don't think he's going to change during the divorce. During the marriage, he had all the reasons in the world to want to make you happy.
That's right.
And now he no longer is taking that as one of his life projects. He quit that job. And so why do you think he's going to change now?
And
Um,
remember that you can always pause before you respond. So even if, again, you're right, it may not make you happy, it may not help the kids. So just take a pause and remember, like you said, it's not likely things are going to get better when someone's no longer your intimate partner. So treat it like that, slightly, if it is, unpleasant business relationship. Be courteous,
mhm,
use Bill Eddy's BIF method for communication. If you don't know what that is, it's
I do.
easy to
But
find.
our
I'm sure
listeners
you
might
do.
not.
Our listeners might
Right.
not. It's really to keep your communication brief. Just provide the information that's necessary, not all the extraneous information you think may belong. Have a friendly tone. It doesn't mean you have to be too nice, but just have a friendly tone and have a firm boundary, which just means when do you need to know what you're asking, or how will you act if you don't hear back by a particular date. And there's great information you can get, Bill Eddy's books on Amazon or in independent booksellers. And it's really a great method for dealing with what might be, at least at the beginning, difficult communication. So if you
Yeah.
really structure your environment for success with good boundaries in your communication, in taking care of yourself, in talking to your kids in a way that they can understand, it can be better. It doesn't mean the time will be easy, but it can be better for you and your kids.
Yeah. And one of the other things they said in that article was figure out what's really important to you and what's not so important to you.
That's lovely. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Because it could feel like everything's important, but the reality is
Right.
in the end, it's not, unless you're playing, the win-lose game. And really getting outside of that framework is everything in separation and divorce, I think.
Yeah. Well, Cherie, it's been a pleasure meeting you and talking to you. And you're doing great work. Keep it up. And I love the model of your cohabitation agreement with your partner to try to, have room for both of your needs and your understanding of each other. It's a great model. And I hope our listeners will be inspired by it.
Thank you,
So,
Rachel. I really appreciate it. And I always do discovery Zooms. So if someone thinks they might want to work with me or talk to me, they go to deardivorcecoach.com and sign up for a discovery Zoom. I'd love to meet you.
oh, that's great. And we'll make sure to put your contact information in the show notes. So thanks for helping us keep the kids in mind.
Thank you, Rachel.